Welcome back to another Think and Reform podcast. My name is Luke Singh, and today we're going to be continuing our look at Dr. Wolfe's questions about non-legislative theonomy and addressing some of his questions and concerns that he has about this political system. And there are a couple things that I want to talk about first. Before we continue on, just a couple of things that might be relevant to what I've said in the last episode, and people have contacted me and asked me questions about what I mean about certain things. And I just want to talk about a couple things that I think are important when trying to establish where we're coming from in this discussion. And Dr. Wolfe is very clear about where he's coming from. He's coming from a natural law perspective, historically reformed perspective, as he claims. But first off, let me say the reason we call this non-legislative theonomy or Lancastrian theonomy is because this is not the current understanding of general equity theonomy. I'm not saying it's not general equity theonomy. It's not the current understanding of general equity theonomy. What I mean by that is general equity theonomists generally still believe in legislation. As you heard in the last episode, you'll hear Dr. Wolfe talk about that. Just put this back on here. That's better. You'll hear Dr. Wolfe talk about that this is different than general equity theonomy. And he says, it's a more pure form. The goal is not to be pure. We don't really judge it by that. I hope we don't anyway, Lord willing. Our goal is to be faithful and consistent with the biblical text. God has told us, I want you to establish justice. And our question is, okay, how do we do that? How do we establish justice in the land? And we take the approach that there are several scriptures that tell us he has told us everything we need to know. He has shown us, right? And in the process of him displaying what I want you to do, he tells us what to do, and he tells us that it can be accomplished the way that he told us to do it. And in that whole process, a legislature is never established, it's never encouraged, it's never promoted. It's never shown in a positive light. So, I mean, in fact, we're told not to, again, in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 12. So general equity theonomy as the current understanding is understood as when they say general equity in the confession there, people are like, okay, the general equity, I find the principle and then I derive law from that principle. That's what general equity means. And when we say general equity from our perspective, we're saying, okay, the general equity is what Solomon was doing with the woman, the two prostitutes. There was no law talking about prostitutes and babies, but he took the general equity of the law and he was able to adjudicate a good result, a just result with what he had. And we believe general equity is applied to adjudication and not legislation, because basically you can grab any law, think of any law that you can, and you can tie it back to a Bible verse somewhere. The worst law that you can think of. And again, you hear people, a lot of general equity theonomists, that's why they justify speed limits, right? Because it's tied back to the parapet law. And there's people who are like, oh, parapet law means all the building codes are legitimate, and we're trying to point out that it's not the government's responsibility to be checking up on our buildings, but the most corrupt politician can look at the Bible and look at the building codes and find the general equity and say, look, see, even the Bible says, look, I'm just doing the general equity too. And we're trying to point out that there's no stopping point. Once you establish a legislature, there's no end point in sight. And the establishment of a legislature, and Chris talks about this too a lot. I encourage everyone to go check out the Lancaster Patriot podcast, especially the last couple of episodes. Chris has been talking about a lot of this. So if you want a very good in-depth look at what we're talking about, check out the last 3 or 4 episodes of the Lancaster Patriot, and also go to Poking the Bear with Matt Kennitzer, who also was talking about this. His last episode has bad sound quality. He apologizes for that. But he does, it's still listen, you can still listen to it. It's a really good episode. But once you establish a legislature, the nature of Christians is to love their neighbor as themselves. That's the nature that is encouraged, the new nature, being transformed by the renewing of our mind. We try to focus on loving our neighbor as ourselves. We don't want to tell our neighbor how to live and how to take care of his business, because I don't want people telling me how to live and how to do my business. So the nature of a legislature is contrary to the ends of the Christian, because we do not want to get in other people's business and tell them how to do it this way. You got to do it this way. It's his land. I want to leave him alone because I want to be left alone. I don't want people coming in and telling me that, hey, we need to, you can't fish in that creek because there's an endangered species there. So the nature of a legislature, the Christians are going to naturally reject a legislative position. Not all Christians will, but just from the Christian philosophy is anti-legislature, because we desire to be humble, and part of being humble is leaving other people alone to do their business. It's their business. If they're not doing anything wrong, I don't want to tell them how to do it right. Okay? I mean, I can encourage him, but I don't want to force him into my perspective, because maybe I'm wrong about how to do whatever it is he's doing. But a legislature will attract people who do like telling other people how to do their business, who do want to promote themselves and offer themselves as saviors to the problems that they create. So the nature of a politician is contrary to the Christian philosophy of how to live and how to love your neighbor. This is again why Christ was clashing with the Pharisees so much. They were basically politicians. They're doing the same thing our legislature is doing. They're making up all these new rules using the general equity of the law to make up all these new rules and teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And Christ condemned them for that. Your responsibility is not to make a whole bunch of laws around the law. You're just supposed to enforce the extant law. So we, instead of abolishing the politicians, and the politicians of Christ's day were the Pharisees. They were politicians. They were coming up with solutions because the Israelites are too stupid to do it themselves. Christ only recognized them when they were doing the right thing. They occupied Moses' seat. Moses was a judge. He was not a legislator. He was a judge. He was supposed to be judging. The Pharisees were supposed to be judging. So that was their purpose, but they weren't. They were legislating. And this caused a lot of problems, obviously. And Christ condemns them for legislating there in Matthew 15. And, they were denying the weightier matters of the law. But humble people are not going to be attracted to this Pharisaical position. It's by its nature Pharisaical. And only frauds and hypocrites thrive in that position. I'll give you an example. Dusty Devers, I do not think he is a fraud or a hypocrite. I think he's a great guy. And I think he's doing a lot of good in his position. But he should not be the lone example of, man, I wish all legislators were like this. He's not being encouraged institutionally. He's not being encouraged. He's not being celebrated institutionally. By us Christians, he is. But institutionally, he's not welcome there. Right? And we should not have these positions in our government where the Christians are institutionally not welcomed. He's operating as a very bold ambassador for Christ. But he's institutionally not welcomed. Shouldn't be like that. The role of pastor, the Christian is institutionally welcomed in the role of pastor. The role of father, the Christian is institutionally welcomed and encourage. I mean, it fits us. We understand a father, how to be a father. The role of father and Christian go together hand in hand. The role of pastor and Christian go together hand in hand. The role of legislator and Christian doesn't. And I think Dusty Deevers, being like this very weird anomaly among all of these corrupt people, is an example of that. The Christians are not welcome in the legislature. The legislator doesn't understand Christians, the Christian and biblical mindset. Its very nature is contrary to that of the Christian mindset, that we promote God's law, and we really don't like man's law that much. In fact, we hate it. So this is different than, all that to say, this is different than general equity theonomy, the way that general equity theonomy is understood today, because general equity theonomy is still tied to a legislature somewhere. And we point out that general equity theonomy, that we want all theonomists to think about this. We want to confront theonomists with these questions that we have. Where does it end when you start making new laws? Do you reach like a critical mass and okay, can't make any more? What principle, because we're all about principles in the Old Testament and the law, what principle do we point to say, okay, once we've reached this many laws, stop. You can all go home now. We're a just and peaceful society. So we're trying to point out that we had just and peaceful societies in the Old Testament when there was no legislative body. Once they developed the legislative function in the king via the kings, and Samuel told them, don't do this. Once they did that, they started oppressing their people, and every single king, as far as I know, maybe with the exception of Josiah, oppressed their people somehow. Maybe Josiah and Hezekiah might be the only ones that you can't find them oppressing their own people. So this is not general equity theonomy that we're dealing with here. So this branch of theonomy, this non-legislative branch of theonomy, we're trying to find the root causes of the past to save the future. We're trying to find out what happened back then and try to save the future of this nation. And this branch of Christian nationalism that I'm dealing with here with Dr. Wolfe, they're trying to solve the problems of the present by sacrificing the future. And I'm not going to say they're like, there's like the big snidely whiplash mustache, and they're like, we're trying to sacrifice the future. I just think that's the result of the solutions that they're offering. We can't have a future with these solutions. Many of them are just the same as the status solutions they offer now, except it's just Christians. I mean, it really sounds like a lot of times, like, I don't know what Dr. Wolfe, after having read his book, and I mean, I wonder what ABC departments he would actually get rid of, because he talks about zoning laws in this podcast. He talks about zoning laws. And it's like, what are we doing with zoning laws? Does Christian nationalism really want zoning laws, like all these ABC departments, of the alphabet departments? Do we want that? Is our solution just to take all the pagans out and fill all the ABC departments with Christians? If we fired all the IRS employees tomorrow and we filled them with Christians, would that be better somehow? Oh my gosh, it might be worse if somebody talked to some of these pietists and these legalist Christians. Nickel and dime you on, like, did you pay every cent of your taxes? I mean, some of them are worse when it comes to these things. I just, after hearing a lot, I'm like, what exactly would he change besides like having a really strong Christian prince and putting the legislative and executive function into one person? Besides that, would he get rid of the ABC departments? I don't know if he would. I mean, the issue is Dowding Castle, okay? Dowding Castle, and there's Christian and faithful. No. Faithful had gone up. Christian and hopeful in Dowding Castle. And if you can imagine an argument breaking out between Christian and hopeful, and I think this is an example of the two camps. I don't think it sums up the whole thing, but this is part of the problem. Christian says, "Hey, let's go back to where we got off of the straight and narrow," and Hopeful says, "Well, I was just trying to get out of Doubting Castle. I'm going to go this way and see if I can get back to the straight and narrow." Or, I mean, I'm not really thinking about the straight and narrow. I'm just glad to be out of Doubting Castle. And Christian's like, "Well, we got to go back to where we got off." And Hopeful's like, "Well, I'm just glad to be out. That was my whole purpose, just to get out." It just seems like one camp wants to get out of Doubting Castle, and one camp wants to go back to the straight and narrow and continue walking down the path. You know, this idea of semper reformanda, as we look to the future and the future of Christendom, we're constantly reforming our ideas. And that brings me to reforming our ideas according to the biblical standard. And that brings me to an objection that was raised. And let me find this real quick. An objection that was raised about the first podcast I did. Let me just bring it up here. There was a I guess somebody on Gab maybe shared the podcast and wrote this critique here. And it says this: Stephen Wolfe, Theonomy is really an escape from politics. It's essentially an attempt to eliminate politics. Luke Saint, theonomist, he's exactly right. That's one of the goals. Theonomy seeks to abolish the office of politician. Now here comes this guy's commentary. I'm not sure who wrote this, but it's above the video that he shared. Saint then goes on to admit that this form of politics has been ubiquitous throughout history. You can't make this up. To anyone who is discerning reality here, Saint is admitting that theonomy is a project that seeks to make a radical, never-before-seen break with the Western Christian tradition. Of course, this should surprise exactly no one has read or even skimmed material prior to the 20th century. And that's the end quote there. It seems to me that reading a book prior to, or skimmed material prior to use his phraseology there, skimmed material prior to the 20th century would reveal that during the time of the Reformation, they kind of said the same thing about the Pope. Like, you think you can have the church without the Pope? We've always had the Pope. So I guess we always need the Pope. Cromwell, what was he experiencing? That book I skimmed prior to the 20th century. What were they saying in that book? Oh, they were saying, well, Cromwell, you got to have a king. You can't do this Republican form of government that you're trying to do. And he kept, if you look at what he was doing, he kept abolishing the politicians because he kept on setting up parliament. Do your job. They turned into power-hungry politicians. He kicked them out. He set them up again. Let's try this again. He came back. They were power-hungry politicians. He just kept kicking them out. And he said, okay, I guess I got to do this myself. But they said, you can't do this without a king. And he said, watch me. So this idea of semper reformanda seems to be, with respect to whoever wrote this, seems to be foreign, that since we've always had politicians, we always need politicians. My rejoinder is this: we have always had tyranny, so I guess we always need tyranny. It's somewhat of a silly and non-reformed, I don't want to be a gatekeeper on what's reformed, but it's a non-reformed approach as we embrace this idea of semper reformanda. We're improving our ideas always. So this form of government not only has existed, but it can exist now and in the future if we're faithful to Christ and his word. But again, that's one of the pitfalls of just listening to the first 5 minutes of a podcast and then just turning it off and being like, oh, this, I'm done listening to this, so I'm so offended or what have you. Just wanted to take care of some housekeeping things. But lastly, I want to say regarding this podcast, Dr. Stephen Wolfe is really representing a case in point example of the mind of a politician. Now he identifies politics. He identifies politics as solving problems. And one thing we like to point out as politics is more like creating problems where there is none, because he's talking about what all these whatabouts. And this is representative, I think, a lot of politicians who sit around and they think of these what about problems, and then they start making laws, and most of the time before the problem even occurs. Let me also give you an example of what I am talking about here. So, of course, after we talked about the fish, a lot of fish talk in that last episode, and Dr. Wolfe talked about fish as well. A friend of mine from my friend Josiah, within, the next day after he listened to the podcast, he's like, you talking about politicians making the problem worse. He sent me this message. He said, listening to your most recent episode on Think and Perform, on the subject of the government being in control of the fisheries, if you look into the issue of bycatch in Alaska, it becomes very clear that the government cannot understand how the industry actually works. Bycatch is whatever a commercial fishing boat will bring in that isn't the species that is being targeted. For example, if a boat is targeting king salmon but accidentally brings in longcod, that would be considered bycatch. The problem is that the regulations have made it so that the fisherman cannot sell that, lingcod, cannot sell that lingcod because he isn't licensed for it. However, depending on that fishing method, I think it was sneeze. That lingcod will not. However, depending on that fishing method, that lingcod will likely not be able to survive the process of being brought into the boat and handled. Thus, the fish is wasted because it cannot be sold, but neither can it be released, all because of political intervention. The end result is that, he told me later, the end result is that tens of millions of pounds of fish are wasted every year. So here's an example of exactly what Dr. Wolfe is talking about. Let's regulate the fishing. And it turns out, just a perfunctory look at what's going on, fish, like I said before in the last podcast, they start killing the fish. Because here it is. You can only catch this amount of king salmon, and you can only catch this amount of lingcod. Oops. Looks like you caught some lingcod when you were only supposed to go out and catch salmon. Looks like they need to die because they can't survive the trip back to being put out or what have you. They might die en route back to the dock. But now that they're dead, you think, okay, well, I don't know. I guess it's just collateral damage. I guess I can sell them, right? Nope, can't sell them. Can't sell them. So now they're just dead and they're wasted. This is what politicians do. They create a problem where there is none using this. Well, maybe the fish will die if we don't solve the problem for you right now. And what ends up happening is crony capitalism as bigger and bigger corporations get into bed with the politicians, and then these massive organizations develop, and the individual business owner is crushed beneath all the regulation licensing fees, which Dr. Wolfe promotes. This is not conducive to our purpose as Christians in taking dominion. We're not here to support these giant bloated corporations. And politics, the way it's instituted in our country, just really promotes these bloated corporations, crony capitalism, and the crushing of the individual business owner. But that's an example. I'll give you another example of this, of them trying to solve a problem but just making it worse. Back in the Regency years, highway robbery was a huge problem in England. And what they did was they said, okay, since it's such a huge problem, let's up the penalty. As Dr. Wolfe has argued, like sometimes you need to up the penalty because if the problem becomes more severe, you need to make the punishment worse. What they did was they said, okay, if you rob someone, if you commit highway robbery, that's a capital offense. You will die. Not biblical law, but it's the politicians again, saying here's how we're going to solve the problem. Murders went up. Why? Because since I'm robbing you, before it was not a capital offense, so maybe I can hope that I can get away with this problem. I can get away with it. But now that since I've done a capital offense, why not just murder you too? I'm dead anyway. That was the logic, and that's what happened. Deaths went up. Again, the politicians trying to solve the problem, making it worse because, hey, we're nicer than God. God hasn't told us. He doesn't really know about this problem of highway robbery. And of course, more people died. And probably another example would be the increase of child deaths after the government instituted child safety caps. Now, I've heard people challenge this, so I'm not going to say this is like Exhibit A, but if I understand correctly, what happened was the government instituted laws regarding child safety. Some business guy came up with this idea of child safety caps for drugs and pills and painkillers and things like that. The government said, hey, good idea. Now everyone has to do it. So they made a law. Everyone's got to do it. Child deaths went up. Child deaths went down. Child deaths went up. Why? Because people started leaving the medicine around thinking their child could not get it open, right? It's a child safety lock. So they would leave it out more. And as everyone knows with children, there's basically nothing childproof. So child deaths went up. I think that if you look into the result, if you can even track the result of any man-made law, I think you will generally see the trend going down. So Dr. Wolfe says basically, generally speaking, politics is solving problems with exceptions. And we're like, our camp is saying, no, politics is creating problems with exceptions and instituting problems. They institute these problems and they oppress their own people. So with that, let's continue on. Hope that wasn't too long for everyone. So let's continue on with Dr. Wolfe's discussion here, and we'll take a listen here.
And yet some people need monarchies. Sometimes you need other political forms, other political systems. This is what the founders believed too, is that America can do a sort of experiment in liberty because of their unique circumstances of self-government, their history of self-government, the fact that they came over from ships and they established in the wilderness their towns and they had town covenants, and they had a tradition and a political life of self-determination, of self-government. They were prepared for it and they were ready for it. And that,
I think that's what really important, what he says, that they were prepared for it and they were ready for it. One thing that we promote at Future of Christendom is this idea of what happens when America balkanizes. What kind of government are we going to set up? We've got to be prepared to set up a new government. We can't do the same thing that we did. The American experiment cannot be replicated. We've got to improve on it because it did not result in favorable circumstances in the context of dominion. We are all enslaved. We're killing our own babies. It's a mess. We're not inviting the blessing of God with the political system that we have. So we're trying to get this out there to say, listen, we're going to be presented again with an opportunity somewhere, somehow. Maybe it won't be America, but Christians will be presented again with a clean slate, Lord willing. We cannot do this again. We cannot establish a legislature again. We must institute the law of God. And we've got to be ready, and we got to be thinking in terms, we got to be following Deuteronomy 6. Write them on your doorpost, write them on your forehead, and in between your, teach them to your children. We've got to be doing that so that when it goes down, the Christians will be able to rise up and say, here's what we want. That's what happened in America. And that was because the pulpit was preaching the full counsel of God. In my opinion, the difference between the French Revolution and the American War for Independence was the pulpit. It was the pulpit preaching these things faithfully. The French had kicked out all the Protestants, so there goes their faithful preaching and teaching. So theirs resulted in bloodshed because nobody knew what they were doing. But I think that the population was much more just and righteous forget about the pulpits, but just the spiritual capital that was left over from the Puritans. They were much more able to control what happened in the American War for Independence. And the difference was the pulpits preaching the full counsel of God as best as they could back then. And we've got to be doing that now. If our pastors don't do anything, and all this we're saying, well, Luke, what do we do now? If your pastors don't do anything and they just go back to men's breakfasts and the doctrines of grace, and they're not fighting the battles that are happening right now, child sacrifice, theft by the state, corruption, institutional corruption, and they're not speaking against these things and they're not teaching the solution to these things, then we as a nation will get another chance and we'll fall right back into tyranny. So his point is they were ready. But why were they ready? Because they had the spiritual capital. Where did that spiritual capital come from? Did it come from the English church? No. It came from the American church and the history of being faithful, the history and the bulwark of the Puritans and the Covenanters and the Presbyterians of that time.
That's why America has been successful for a long time, or was for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There was that flexibility because the circumstances, the nature of the people permitted them to be to function in a sort of what you want to call classical liberal model. Other places need monarchy. Other places want monarchy. Other places like the idea that you'd have a stable hereditary monarchy where it passes from one person to the other. That's their constitution. That's what they want. They've developed a constitution over time. Just take like England, how it's developed its constitution in relation to the king and parliament and their other their judges. They've developed the constitution over time. We have as well. This is another...
Where they've developed it and where they went right, they went towards biblical law and the biblical system. Where they went wrong, they went away from it. So as we're developing our systems and we're honing these things, the closer we get to biblical law, and that's a claim of so many Americans. They're like, and American Christians are like, the Constitution was great because it's most like biblical law. Why don't we just do biblical law? Why settle for the imitation of Elvis when you have Elvis right there? It's like seeing the real Elvis and an Elvis imitator and choosing the Elvis imitator because he's most like Elvis when Elvis is standing right next to him. Why don't we just do the actual thing that we're trying to imitate?
The thing about that the purist theonomists can't deal with is they can't. There's no constitution. There's no clear political system of rules, checks and balances, of different political bodies having different functions. In the U.S. Constitution, you look at Article 1, 2, and 3, and the first line says the legislative power will be invested or divested in Congress, and then the executive in the presidency, and then the judicial in the judicial branch. And so they determined constitutionally you have three functions of government. All three functions theoretically could be placed on one person. But the founders said, you got these basic functions: lawmaking, law executing, and law adjudicating. We're going to separate them into three different branches of government, and they're going to have checks and balances among each other. And that is constitutionally, from experience, how we were going to order ourselves. Now, if you look at, on the matter of the U.S. Constitution, is a clear example of politics. We have the notes from the framing convention that produced the U.S. Constitution. James Madison was there, and probably his scribe was writing all the various speeches from the different people, and some of them are summarized, but we get a general feel for what they were talking about. And they never quoted scripture or theology or anything like that. Now, I'm not saying that's good that they never did. I do think it was a mistake that they didn't put Christ in the Constitution. So I'll say that was a mistake.
I agree with him there.
But their deliberations was good in this sense, that it was based upon not even like abstract philosophy. It wasn't based upon theology. It was mainly based upon assumptions about human nature connected with the political experience of the ages. So,
and I guess this is another area where we disagree. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing because of what happened right away. Washington marched on the veterans of the American War for Independence, the people that put these guys in power, and their blood, sweat, and tears. Obviously, Washington did that as well. Blood, sweat, and tears, anyway. The blood, sweat, sweat and tears of the American War for Independence, and their government immediately started marching on their own people for not paying taxes. Can you lay that at the feet of the Constitution? Probably. Other scandals that happened, what's it called? Yazoo, the Yazoo conspiracy. I forget what it was, but down in Georgia, what happened as innocent people lost land and the politicians grabbed it up, and it was this whole scandal, and the government immediately started oppressing their own people. When you read through the book of Judges, you don't see that. The government was not oppressing their own people because they didn't have the ability, the way that our government has the ability. The establishment of a legislature, and with each new law that gets passed, we lose more freedom. Every law that gets passed, to say nothing of pork bills. I've been what's it called? Lobbying a couple times with my friends from Abolish Abortion PA, Sal Piccolo and Dave Coyle and Aaron Pratt and those guys, and Andrew Horvath. And it's just so frustrating to walk through the halls of our nation, of our state's capital, because you just hear clapping like every 20 minutes. There's clapping. And every time I hear that, I'm like, there goes more of our freedom. A new law passed telling us we got to do something. They're not getting rid of laws. But it's like every 20 minutes, every hour, there's this press conference and we're all clapping of this new thing being passed. And every time it happens, we lose more freedom. And this is the problem of politics, that the more power you give politicians, the less freedom you have. It's just the inevitable result. So the American experiment, my question is, why are we experimenting? He says right there, they weren't quoting scripture, but they did put scripture everywhere throughout the Capitol building, and on the Liberty Bell says, proclaim liberty throughout the land. That's a Bible verse about the year of Jubilee. Now, the Bible can make that claim, but we did not get liberty the way the Bible gives us liberty. We did not get true liberty. We got temporary freedoms that are basically, almost all of them are now gone. We're not a free people. We've never been a free people. We've been freer. But only Israel, in the time of the judges, was free in the most consistent and biblical meaning of that word. When God said proclaim liberty throughout the land, he's saying they actually had liberty. They actually had it. We did not have it as Americans. Washington marching on his own people for not paying taxes set the precedent. You're not free. You owe us money, and we will attack you if you do not pay it. Now, was it all chaos after then? Have we been in chains and, everyone's just been gloomy and all that kind of stuff? No, we've been freer and we've been incredibly blessed. But that's not the goal, to be freer and have more liberty than all the other nations. God's not telling us to just be more just. This is not a gradient. We have to establish justice in the land. That's our purpose as a government. The magistrate must give the people justice. And the American experiment just didn't do that. We were more just, we were more free, but we did not go all the way. And there's no reason why we can't. You can quote Junius and Aquinas all you want, but if they never existed, we would still have the ability to establish justice. A man in his Bible can reverse engineer all the principles of justice and righteousness from those pages. If he never read Aquinas or Aristotle or Junius or any of those guys, he could still establish justice and he could establish a godly and righteous nation with those pages. That's the claim of the Bible.
So they would reference Rome. They would reference the Swiss Federation. They would reference political
Yeah, and when the dust settles, what's holding up our courthouses? Roman columns.
theorists such as Montesquieu. They would reference the British Constitution. They would reference all these things as, hey, what's worked given the collective experience of humanity, and what will work for us as our own people, because they're dealing with separate colonies, but they want a more robust, national central government. So
If he's praising this, my question is, I just thought we were sola scriptura. That's all. I just thought we were. Now, I don't know if he would say, okay, sola scriptura in the church, but not sola scriptura in the state. To me, that makes no sense. I hope it's sola scriptura in your family. I hope it's sola scriptura in your business. To say sola scriptura means that the scriptures occupy a place of authority that surpasses all other forms of authority, tradition, the ex cathedra or ex cathedra, however you pronounce that. The state, legislation, the scriptures above all that. We're sola scriptura people. And it seems like to me, Dr. Wolfe is saying it's good that they weren't sola scriptura people here. It's confusing to me, given that he's, all about the Reformed tradition.
So what is going to work given the collective experience of mankind plus our own individual circumstances? And that's how we got the Constitution. It's a very good example of how politics works. You identify some good given the circumstances, and then you figure out how do we constitute, or what are the means for.
And there's another big difference, right? He identifies some good. He's all about identifying the good. And God is saying, I have shown you. He has shown you what is good. Micah 6:8. You know it already. Don't need any other deliberation about should we be outlawing fishing.
For that. And in this case, what sort of arrangements are we going to have for our political system that guarantees that we don't slide into tyranny and that we properly serve the good and the liberty of the people of the United States?
But we did. We slid into liberty right away. Right away. If you don't believe me, look up the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Embargo Acts, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Yazoo Conspiracy. If I'm saying that one correctly, I can't remember if I'm doing that one right. These things we slid into tyranny right away. The Constitution provides the raw materials of tyranny. They established it. It says that Congress has the right to regulate the commerce. And so everything that you complain about, the government getting involved in your business, every politician is going to look and say, there it is, chapter and verse. I'm allowed to regulate your commerce. Tyranny. Right away. Tyranny. And oh, by the way, it's the supreme law of the land. Tyranny. It was just a matter of time before we got to let's start killing the babies.
Okay, that was a good example of politics, but theonomists can't do that. I would also argue that it's a violation of just of human nature itself. Thank you. It's a violation of human nature itself that to eliminate the good of the good of deliberation and deciding upon the good of the people.
And again, the focus is to relegate that to its proper place. I have no authority to walk into Stephen Wolfe's house and tell him how to live his life. But if I do that and his life becomes better, does that mean that's legitimate? What if he's, mismanaging his money and I'm better with money than he is, and I walk in there and say, well, for the good of your house, I'm going to violate my responsibility as a Christian to you and tell you how to run your finances, but it's for your good. That's completely irrelevant. He's going to tell me, get lost, this is not your business, and he's going to be 100% correct. It's the same with the politicians. It's none of your business. The good of society is not your business. That's my business. It's the church's business. It's the family's business. It's the business of the fifth government business. It's their priority, not yours. You're supposed to establish justice in the land. That's it. Only prerogative given to you by God. That's it.
I think in ancient Israel, they of course had the laws of God. But are you telling me there weren't rules in the various tribes, that they didn't have some sort of process of saying do this or don't do that? They don't have a set of customs.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, as like I said in the last podcast, and in Ruth chapter 4, you see that there were customs. It's just they're relegated to the right place. They're put in the right place so that they can't become law. And again, this is Christ condemning the Pharisees. You guys are legislating, and you're teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And here's Dr. Wolfe saying we should be politics is teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So it's a great thing. It's something we need. And I don't understand why the Theonomists don't want that. Maybe because we read Matthew chapter 15. We realize this is a bad idea.
They don't have customs that would distinguish them from other people. And that's, and to bring up custom, that's another issue. Traditionally, political theorists have identified, or they've distinguished between law, and they've distinguished between that and custom. Law is explicit, it's clear, it's direct, it's in your face, it's promulgated, it's in a law book, and you know what's right and what's wrong. Custom is something that's developed over time, sometimes apart from memory. You don't know when this arose, you just know that we do this here. It's implicit, it's usually you're socialized into it, and it has a tremendous effect on the socialization and the collective life of a people. It's basically what distinguishes you from other people. And it takes on the form of a law. Now, theonomists, they can't have custom because custom itself takes on a certain properties of a law, namely that we, the people, expect our fellow members to do this sort of practice. This is good manners. This is these are bad manners. This is how we communicate. This is how we speak.
It's just, again, it's not like I informed him, but again, I mean, we have chapter and verse in the Bible saying this was the custom of Israel in Ruth chapter 4. This is what they were doing. This is the custom. And he's like, the theonomists can't have that. It's like, well, how did they get it? How did Israel get it? I mean, if it just really seems like if the government required me to do a handshake to you every time I saw you, Dr. Wolfe would be saying, if we didn't have the government telling us how to do handshakes, then no one would be doing it. How do you get custom without the government telling us how to do it? This is, I mean, a point I keep bringing up is I really believe that people, the way that Dr. Wolfe's thinking, and people like Dr. Wolfe, if we did not have the right to assemble, and we came to people like Dr. Wolfe and said, can we have the right to peaceably assemble? He'd say, no. You can't be trusted with that. What if you're lying? What if while you're assembling, you create an army and you show up with guns and you say you want to peaceably assemble, but secretly you want to do an army? I can't give you that right. You can't have that responsibility. It's my responsibility to make sure that there's peace and order, and this is not conducive to that. You guys could get disorderly. So no, you can't have the right to assemble. I just think that's the kind of the kind of mindset that we're dealing with here.
This is our language. This is how we greet one another. This is the sort of how we act in certain places. So in a restaurant, we act a certain way. In a library, we act a certain way. In a church, we act a certain way. In a playground, we act a certain way. In a ball field, we act a certain way. All these collective customs and traditions, and just broadly speaking, a way of life, the people can't have any sort of implicit demand upon those people to conform to a way of life.
Can you think of a tradition that has just been established by the government, and if you by a politician? Can you point to a tradition established by a politician? I suspect there are some out there, but I'm thinking about like Christmas, the handshake, maybe spitting in your hand and shaking someone's hand. He has risen indeed. These holidays, trick-or-treating, the Yule log, mistletoe. Theonomy, because it restricts the ability to force people to do things a certain way according to the whims of the politicians and not according to God's law. It places a higher premium on tradition and custom. And it allows them to thrive because the same society, legally speaking, that I die in will be the same one that my great-great-grandchildren will wake up in, because nobody's changing the law. This allows traditions to thrive and really take a hold, because there's nobody changing the law that could outlaw certain traditions or that could change the mindset of the people to such an extent where they don't practice that tradition anymore. So the fact that the government is severely limited, this places a higher premium on traditions. This places a higher premium on custom. This will result in more traditions and more custom, because traditions and customs are a good thing. And when the magistrate, the church, the family, and the individual and business are all confined to their roles and are doing what God had told them to do, this results in traditions and customs in the culture which are beneficial to the people. And since there's no legislature to come along and say, well, I don't want you to do that tradition anymore, now these traditions can thrive and can take a stronger hold in the community.
So for a theonomist, then you can't even have a way of life. Your way of life is nothing but thou shalt not do these evils. And that's it. You don't have a collective set of practices that distinguishes you from anyone else. So if we had a world of just pure theonomic states, which I do wonder how you'd establish borders. For a theonomist, it would be bad if there were differences between them, because differences between nations are expectations. Again, they're quasi-laws. That's what, they're implicit demands that people act a certain way. Can't have it. The other thing would be,
I really have no idea how he's tying that to theonomy and the lack of the office of politician. Like, you can't have traditions. I just don't. I don't see the tie to big state equals more traditions and more customs, and the proper, the proper government that God has established equals no traditions and no customs. I don't get the tie there. I really don't. To me, it's a little strange to put that on theonomy like that. It doesn't make sense. Maybe it makes sense to you. Obviously, it makes sense to Dr. Wolfe, but I don't see how having this massive state apparatus that we have now, this cancerous blob that eats everything it touches, means that, is good for traditions and customs. Makes no sense to me. In fact, I see traditions going by the boards, the bigger the state gets. So it's, I don't know. I don't get that one. All the traditions I can think of, none of them are tied to the state. Maybe there's one obvious one, a couple obvious ones I'm missing. I'm just really trying to think of a time when politicians created tradition through the legislature. I see them instituting extant traditions, like, recognizing a holiday like Thanksgiving, but it was already a tradition. We were already doing it before them. before that. So it doesn't make sense to me where this is coming from.
How do you do with international relations if you don't have lawmaking authority? Let's say China wants to dump cheap goods and destroy your industry. They want to destroy your industry. What are you going to do about that? Can't
see? But again, thinking like a politician, Dr. Wolfe here is like, that would destroy our industry if they dump goods in here. And again, this is ours. Whatabouts. We're concerned about innocent blood polluting the land. And his whatabouts are, what if China dumps cheap goods into your industry? I don't want to make the case that Dr. Wolfe doesn't care about justice and righteousness in the land. I know he does. Any Christian does, right? But the examples he keeps bringing up, we're talking about innocent blood polluting the land. And you can't have, I mean, your economy is irrelevant if you're polluting the land with innocent blood. And he's like, well, what if China comes along and dumps cheap goods into the market? So, do you think we're that stupid that's not a problem that we could overcome? That would cripple everything? Like, it's over. China's here with their cheap goods. Oh no, there goes America. Quick, call the politicians so that we can surrender more of our freedoms to stop this, so that we have a nation and we're all tied up in duct tape with 1 million laws restricting us from doing everything. The whole thing is silly to me.
Do you have the lawmaking authority to enact tariffs?
No.
Can you? Do you have any sort of authority to act internationally at all? Who's the head of state who's going to negotiate and have treaties and have international relations with other peoples and other places?
That has been disastrous in certain circumstances. This whole treaty thing, was pointed out to me by one of my friends on one of my groups. If you look at the, if you look at the treaty between Churchill, if you look at the treaty, sorry, I want to get the name right. The treaty between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. They had the authority to make this treaty, but they all sold out their own people. And Russia, I mean, all those nations like Estonia, Romania, they were all sold out in that treaty. The Germans were sold out in that treaty. They became slaves. A lot of horrible things happened because of that treaty. A lot of horrible things have happened through treaties. People gambling and trading things that they're not allowed to trade as if they owned them. So no one has the ability to make a treaty and gamble other people's lives and trade other people like their cattle, the way that the treaty has been historically used. The leader of a theonomic nation cannot say, well, okay, you take this land, I'll take that land. Okay, let's divide it up. And why don't we cut off the Germans from the food supply while we're at it? No, you don't have the authority to do that. This is one of the point of the America First people is like, maybe we shouldn't have the authority to make that. Maybe the politicians should not be gambling and trading with the assets of a country like they do with treaties. Bad idea.
Is that person elected? If he's elected, how long is he in office? How do you remove him if he's bad? What do you do? The problems go on and on and on. If you escape from politics entirely, you can't deal with reality. You can't deal with the way things are in the world. You can't have international relations. And also, it means you can't even have treaties, because a treaty itself functions as law for you. It's not just the law between nations. It functions as a law for the nation itself. That is why in our U.S. Constitution, the president can negotiate treaties. He can agree to treaties himself, but only becomes an established treaty after the Senate approves it. And there's a good reason for that, because it functions in a way as a law. It can actually limit. This is one of the ways, like, people criticize Obama and others for trying to enact environmental regulations through treaty. So anyway, that's the different thing. But yeah,
I think it's funny that his example that he brought up was a negative one. If I'm understanding that correctly, I think he just used a negative example of his own. He was trying to paint a positive light of treaties, and he used a negative example to do that. Can anyone think of a positive treaty that can be like, here's why we need treaties? As far as I know, I can think of a couple, but I don't think they are something that is necessary for a politician who represents the nation to view and start cutting up other nations as assets. That's usually what happens with treaties. You get this, I get that. It's not your authority to gamble these people and trade these people like chess pieces.
so you can't even make treaties, or if you can make treaties, well, no, because let's say you have your treaty is an alliance, and it's a defense alliance. So, we get a defense alliance with say Canada, and a defense
Or Israel.
alliance means that if Canada is attacked, then it functions as if they're attacking us. Okay, they're not attacking us, but the effect is they're attacking all of us. You attack one, you attack all.
Just not good for a nation to tie themselves with other nations. Biblically speaking, it's been a bad idea. God often punishes Israel for tying themselves to other nations. Shouldn't have done that, because the leader of a country should not be tying himself to another nation. Because what if that nation suddenly doesn't have your nation's best interest in mind? It has its own best interest in mind and drags you into war, as has happened.
Can theonomists go into a treaty like that? Because
Nope.
You're establishing a U.S. law that says that if Canada is attacked, the U.S. then is bound by treaty/law to act as if they were the ones attacked.
The Bible tells us how to do war, and it does not involve treaties. And basically, the concept of war, according to God, is voluntary. The people fight the war. The ecclesiastical authority approaches the army and says, "You're about to go to war." And to make a long story short, is anyone's heart not in this? If you're not in this, you have no responsibility to go to war. This prevents the politicians from getting hold of the people as assets and using them as pawns, and forces them to either lead it themselves, which they will not do. It's contrary to the office of politician. They will not do that. Or what it forces a nation to do is to have, if it is going to war, it's only going to war if the heart is involved. If my heart is in this, I'm going to go to war. But if my heart is not in this, I'll make up an excuse. Yeah, I bought a vineyard. I'm out of here. Don't need to justify yourself, really. But that's the responsibility of the ecclesiastical authority to say, as we're going to war, if your heart is not in this, then leave. And if no one's heart is in it, then they won't make the war. And that way, the people control the politicians, because they're not forced into anything. This again goes back to, I wish I would have said this at the beginning, this goes back to, I'm sure Dr. Wolfe is very aware of this problem of the one and the many. How do we prioritize the one and the many, right? The multitude and the individual. Who do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the needs of the one, or do we prioritize the needs of the multitude? And politicians sit around and think about this all the time. Philosophers sit around, they think about this all the time. If we do this, well, then now we're prioritizing the individual. Is that good? Is that bad? And then if we do that, we're prioritizing the mob. And is that good or is that bad? And one is always sacrificed for the other. But we reverse engineer our ideas of the one and the many from the Trinity. The Trinity is the perfect balance, the perfect example of the one and the many, the multitude and the individual. And they exist in complete harmony, and they don't need to sacrifice each other. The one and the many never sacrifice the other one's needs for its own. And that goes back to, the Father sending the Son, but the Son, I lay down my life, and no one's forcing me to do this, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this character nature of the Trinity is in perfect union, but it perfectly balances the needs of the one and the many. Since the law of God is made after the character and nature of the Trinity, it perfectly takes into account the one and the many. And it balances these like no other political system can do. The politicians will, yes, they will, 100%. They will sacrifice the one for the many, and they will sacrifice the many for the one. They don't know how to do it outside of God's law. But since God's law is based on the character and nature of a triune God who perfectly balances the needs of the one and the many, in society, the needs of the one and the many are perfectly balanced. But people who develop their own political systems like Dr. Wolfe, they don't know how to do that. So they will sacrifice them. And actually in his book, he does talk about that. Sometimes some people need to suffer for the multitude. That's in his book.
But they weren't attacked. So can theonomists have basic treaties, collective defense treaties? I just don't know how. I frankly don't. It makes me think like that a lot of theonomists, they haven't studied. They've studied the Bible. I'm not doubting that they love the Bible. But have they considered the full array of politics? Have they
We're considering the history of politics and what has happened when people are put in positions like this, and they abuse it. And then we consider what the Bible has to say about politics, and we're like, why do we need this office? And what ends up happening is when you look at it, you look at a problem that the politicians are trying to solve, and then they solve it, but then this creates new problems, and then they solve those. Those create new problems. The problems keeps intensifying. The problems keep expanding. And then you look back and you ask, what problem were we trying to solve in the first place? Overfishing? Historically, that's what happens with politicians and politics. They just keep creating new problems, and then they create more offices who solve those new problems. But then they create new problems, and they create more offices that solve those problems. Why the ABC? I mean, the Department of Education is to solve the problem of us being number one back in 1974. Now we're like number 24 or something like that, thanks to the Department of Education. That's what theonomists do. We look at that and say, that was just such a horrible idea. But then Dr. Wolfe looks like that and like, well, they must have been solving a problem. That's politics. They identify the problem and then they solve it. But all these ABC organizations, these alphabet organizations, they just make the problem worse. And these are politicians, and they're using politics. That's what we do. We look at what God's law has to say about politics, and we look at the history of politics, and we compare the two. But mainly what we do is we start with how the Bible tells us how to do government, and then we judge all other governments by that standard.
Considered the comprehensive nature of politics, not only the various domestic issues, which is enough, I think, to defeat the idea, but the international issues.
Again, his examples of the domestic issues was overfishing, who's going to control the roads, septic problems, water problems, and I think he talks about zoning later. But that enough is enough to defeat theonomy. Those worst case scenario examples is enough to defeat theonomy. It's not a very good case, in my opinion.
I don't know how. Frankly, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how. I would love to hear, like, a theonomist give an account of international relations in a theonomic state. Now, what I suspect people could do then in response, and I think someone like James White would do this, is that they would do a form of a Jesus juke. But let's putting that aside. what they would do is say, okay, yeah, fine, Wolfe. Yeah, those all sound like problems. But what we're talking about is the post-millennial hope. we're talking about the post-millennial hope as the nations Christianize.
I mean, no need for a theonomist to do that. All we do is just redirect poor Dr. Wolfe back to Deuteronomy. Say, how do you do it? Or just read Deuteronomy. It's really that simple. Read Judges. I mean, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. All existed with only God giving the law. And there's an argument that they already knew the law because God praises Abraham for following his laws. And in Exodus 18, before the law is given on Sinai, Moses is already telling the people God's judgments concerning things. So to some extent, they always kind of knew God's law. Maybe it wasn't written down, but God's law was always present with them. And this was understood that the legislative function was reserved to God. They weren't allowed to make their own laws. And again, that's in the law that you're not allowed to make your own laws. You're not allowed to add to it or take away from the law. And his think is the only good is line of thinking here is the only good response to this is a Jesus juke. If go back and read your Bible as a Jesus juke, then call me guilty of that.
Everything becomes better. In a way, human nature becomes better because everyone's Christian and we're all being sanctified. And so all those problems, Wolfe, that you're identifying, they'll just go away. There won't be problems anymore. You won't need defense alliances anyway. You won't need treaties. That's the move. I've seen this. It's like whenever theonomists who are post-mill get stuck, whenever they get stuck with an obvious practical, even theoretical, I'd say, problem with their theonomy, they jump to postmillennialism. And it's a way to essentially escape reality. It's a way to escape politics now and to place it in the realm of essentially the promises of providence. Which really means that you can't do politics now until there's a massive revival, until there's like obvious that the kingdom is here. You can't actually do comprehensive politics at all.
No need to jump to postmillennialist. I mean, I am a postmillennialist, but there's no need to jump to postmillennialist when it's just the problem could be solved just by reading your Bible and knowing your Bible, loving your Bible, meditating on the law of God day and night. Solve a lot of problems. Read Psalm 119. That's the lens that I use when I read the law. I read it through the lens of Psalm 119. That's basically, my hermeneutic. I take Psalm 119. Obviously, I don't limit it to that. But, the New Testament obviously has a lot to say about the law. You take that into account as well. And you view the law through the New Testament. But you don't have to abandon Psalm 119 in the process. So just my encouragement or challenge to Dr. Wolfe would read Psalm 119 and then read the law in light of Psalm 119. There's a lot of claims in that chapter about how great the law is. It's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm wiser than my teachers. I'm wiser than I know more than my enemies. I'm more learned than the aged. All of your ways are just. I consider all your ways to be right. Psalm 19, the law of the Lord is perfect. Who can discern his errors? That's given in the context of the law. I guess Dr. Wolfe can discern a lot of errors with God's law.
You can't participate at all. You would show up. It's like if you're suddenly elected miraculously to a city council or a county commission.
Just assuming that these things would exist. The city council. It's just anyone who's watched a school board meeting lately would just be like, why would you even theorize a city council these people are the worst kind of politicians. They're so petty. They're so corrupt. They're all over the nation. They're just instituting transgender policies and homosexual policies. I mean, they're doing the liberal thing, which is give freedom to the perverts and the baby killers, but then enslave everybody else. It's just shocking.
And all of a sudden, this commissioner refuses to even talk about zoning laws, water issues, sewage and septic.
It would just be so great. It would just be so great if a commissioner was like, I'm going to stop interfering with people's lives and let's just let them figure it out. Just relegate this idea of problem solving to its proper place. Let the people figure it out. Don't need laws. Don't need laws. They can just figure it out themselves through their business. That's part of business, is identifying the problem, finding the solution, and then doing it. Business people are way better at it than politicians. They often come along and solve the problems that politicians make without creating more. But that would be just great if my commissioner was if I met him and he was like, yeah, I just been shooting down everyone's idea basically. They're always coming to me. If you talk to my dad, he goes to the county commissioners meeting, and he keeps on saying it's just hard for me to go to these meetings because people are just always asking for money, and the commissioners are always giving it to them. It's taxpayers' money. And the statism and the state worship that is involved, it's like a church service in there. You got these three guys, and we all go and they grovel before them, and they dispense taxpayer money after threatening people's lives for it. And here we are with this idea of like, man, I mean, what if a commissioner takes a biblical approach to these things? How horrible would that be?
Business regulations, anything, because you don't think that any of this matters, or that doesn't matter. It'd be unjust for you to enact or participate, and all you do is just say all this stuff is wrong. We should just take this as the Bible.
That's one thing why a lot of people love Ron Paul, is because they call him Mr. No. Like every new law that was given, he would vote against it. It's one reason a lot of people love Ron Paul. I'm not a libertarian, but I can't help but love Ron Paul.
You're useless in politics.
Yeah, great. Useless in politics. Excellent. That means you're not stepping on anyone's toes. Oh man, that would be a great epitaph. Here lies this guy. He was useless in politics. Oh my word, I'd put flowers on his grave every year.
Literally no one in history they'd all think that you're crazy, and no one would actually take you seriously. You wouldn't get elected in the first place. And so in the end, the post-mill theonomic...
Again, this goes back to my point that somebody who actually cares about his neighbor and his property is not institutionally welcomed. He just said it. Someone who actually believes in biblical law is not institutionally welcomed here. We've created this whole apparatus where the Christian is not institutionally celebrated or welcomed. And he wants a Christian nation. How are we getting this when the Christians aren't institutionally welcomed with the offices and the apparatus that we create?
Politics, not all, I keep saying, this is not everyone, okay? It's not everyone. But for a lot of people, it's not just that it's an escape from politics. You can't be political now. All you can be is a guy who theorizes about what the future theonomic state will be like.
In a room full of politicians, when Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, it was Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and Daniel showed up. In a room full of politicians, as faithful as they were to God and his law, that's how successful they were in the most corrupt place in the entire world at that point, Babylon. And they weren't promoted because they solved problems that nobody had. They were promoted because they were faithful to God and his word, and they were already wiser than everyone before they even showed up. But this is the promise of Psalm 119.
Because for you to participate is for you to participate in what you think is evil. Now, you might you might admit that, yeah, that zoning regulation, that seems on its face, that seems to make sense. Like, we don't want, it makes sense that people in the country don't want to, they don't want a huge warehouse across the street that could likely fail and leave just a ghost warehouse for years with the ugly barbed wire fencing and all this stuff. That makes sense.
That makes sense. We give up our private property rights. We give up our private property rights so that we don't have ugly warehouses. And if we're up to me, if I can have my private property rights the way that God has given them to me, or and the ugly warehouse, or if I had no private property rights because I have to listen to the state when they tell me where to put my house and how to put it and what to put on it and how many screws in my wall and, zone it correctly and tell me all these other things and make all these other laws. But I don't have the ugly warehouse. Boy, what a trade-off. Yes, I will gladly sacrifice my private property rights so that I don't have that ugly warehouse. It just sounds, respect to Dr. Wolfe, it just, all these whatabouts just kind of sound like they're coming from a middle-aged white suburban lady. With respect to Dr. Wolfe, it just sounds like that. I know that this is not his whole thing. He cares about justice in society, but just his examples, I'm like, I don't expect this from somebody like Dr. Wolfe. I just don't. This sounds like somebody shouting these at me from a white SUV. It sounds like like he's on the board of an HOA. These just not real problems when compared to the other problems that we're facing.
Maybe we should vote for that, against that plan, because it seems really dumb and it seems like it would be bad for the people there. But you can't do that because, one, you probably don't believe in zoning regulations in the first place, and also you don't believe in the very idea of voting for a new law at all. I guess perhaps you could say I'll vote no, but if you vote no, you're consenting to the process, which is to have a legislative body. It's also weird. You can't even join the legislature because you don't believe in legislation, so you can't be a part.
I think you can join the legislature. I think it is okay to pass laws getting rid of old laws. I think that's fine. If you join the legislature and your whole purpose is to give the people back the freedoms that they lost because of ugly warehouses, I just can't believe that's a case in point. But I mean, I think it is. You can do in any office that you're in. Like if you find yourself a recorder of deeds, you can be biblically faithful. You can. IRS, probably not. I call this an official proclamation to everybody who's in the IRS. You are sinning against God by being in that office. Repent of that office.
Part of the city council. You can't be a part of the county commissioner. You can't become a state legislature. You can't, certainly not at national level. You can't do any of that. I do wonder too about some theonomists, what they think about if you are most, I wonder if like someone like Durbin and James White are non-legislative theonomists. Because if you are
I don't think they are. I'm not sure about Jeff Durbin. I don't know where he stands, but Dr. White did sign the Statement on Christian Nationalism, put out a couple of years ago, maybe, and in it says, the magistrate has the ability to write laws. So I mean, given that, I think he is not a non-legislative theonomist. I think he's a general equity theonomist that supports the idea of a legislature.
Non-legislative theonomist, then do you believe that the states should ban abortion? Because that would be the creation of a law, right?
No, it would be enforcing extant biblical law.
Or I mean, I guess perhaps you can get around it and say, well, what they're actually doing is they're enacting a biblical law. I guess you could say that, but that's weird. Even though they're not really.
He's to a certain extent very reasonable in all this. You see him sometimes self-correct and think about, well, actually, maybe it would be possible. So I mean, at least he's honest.
doing that. Their source of that law would be the law book of the state or the federal government. It wouldn't be the source of it. Wouldn't be the Bible. They'd have executive of the law. They have public administration. They'd have police force. They'd put people in jail, which you may not agree with at all. Yeah, it's a whole different issue. I could go on and on. I could go on and on about this.
The appeal of Paul that he was a Roman citizen to get himself out of trouble was not a sinful one. I mean, God gives us tools. If I don't think you're sinning against God if you report a pedophile to the state. I don't think he's going to get justice. But I think if we're loving our neighbor, we have to love our neighbor with the tools that we have. Obviously, a better way to love our neighbor, if I came across, the beaten Israelite and I was the Samaritan, the best way would be to call an ambulance. But I don't have those resources, so I got to put them on my donkey. Okay? There's a better way to do it, but I don't have the resources available to me right now. There's a better way to punish a pedophile than putting him in prison and putting a label on him that follows him around. There's a better way to do it, but I don't have those resources available to me. I can love my neighbor with crappy resources.
The point is, okay, let me finish this up, I guess, with the discussion about natural law, because I started off in natural law. To kind of clear it up, when I say I believe in natural law, that does not mean that what I want to do is be nothing with me and my computer in my office reflecting on the natural law and come up with a bunch of laws. That's not at all what I mean. That's not what anyone has ever meant. What they mean is that in order to make a civil law just, it has to be rooted in some sense in the natural law, or the moral law. And so in order for it to be a law at all, it has to essentially be derivative of the natural law. It can be enacted as civil law.
Think of the most corrupt law that you can right now. Think of it right now. And tell me that there's no Bible verse that you can somehow tie it back to and justify it. That's the problem that we're dealing with here. The most corrupt law. The IRS, the existence of the IRS, and then beating down your door to take your money and your property and throw your family on the street. Well, render to Caesar, right? The state taking away your right to private property. Romans 13, submit. Again, render to Caesar. I guess whatever Caesar says is his. If he says it's his, then it must be his. See? Chapter and verse. It's tied to the moral law. And the tyranny that is justified using the parapet law it knows no bounds, no pun intended.
Law, it can, because the natural law is basically a set of principles with ends for mankind, and the civil law is a means in political life to lead or direct, or to bring about the good in the purview of civil political life.
It's not ability to bring about the good. The good is a result. The good is a byproduct of justice established in the society. If you try to go for the good, you're going to miss it because you're going to sacrifice justice along the way. And that's what natural law proponents do. They put human reasoning above God's law. Human reasoning judges God's law, tells God where he went wrong, tells God where he went right. And basically, by the time it's all done, he's like, it's based on the moral law, but it just always seems to be like the only thing that's not instituted is the actual law. It's anything but, really. When you get through the general equity and the divine, the natural law guys, and they're like, yeah, I like some laws in the Old Testament, but they actually never talk about instituting the actual law. It's always this principle based on a principle based on a principle, and then you get something. By the time it goes through that machine, it comes out as something really statist and really weird. But it just always seems like we can do everything. Everything's possible except the actual law. Now, part of the moral law that he's talking about that was established was Deuteronomy 4, which says, don't add to it or don't take away from it. I want to know how he applies that principle. Has he ever applied that principle? Is that even a principle that's on his radar? Any natural law person, do you take that principle and apply it to your political theory. Do not add to it. Do not take away from it. That's a law. Because they're always like, oh, God's law, there's a lot of great principles in there. You can get a principle from everyone. What's the principle from that one? Maybe someone can let me know.
That's the idea. But in creating a law, if you identify a problem in society, whether it's bad, good, or you want to promote some good, you have three things. One, you can reflect through reason on what is good, what is human nature, and you can try to enact that way. You can also apply just basic experience. Hey, the town over did this and it worked. The town over there did that and it actually failed. You could you do things like that. Or hey, you know what? Most nations for most of history had this, like, had a blasphemy law, or they had laws against homosexuality, or whatever. That most people had this, or whatever you want it to be. And also the third one is
Most nations for most history had slavery laws. What do we do about that? We've always had slavery, so I guess we always need it, right? Most nations right now have pro-abortion laws. That's not the standard. What other nations are doing is not the standard. God said in his word that you will stand out as a nation if you follow these laws, Deuteronomy 4. The laws I'm giving you, they're going to be like, wow, what other people is like this? They're going to be impressed by these laws. And it's the laws that God is giving them. Not look out and see what everyone else is doing and come back to me with this amalgamation of this potpourri, this smorgasbord that you guys took a little bit here, a little bit there, and come back and impress me with your decisions. It's not that God attitude. It's not the attitude of the entire Bible. I don't know where this is coming from.
Scripture as well. So in deciding upon a law, you can use your own reason, you can use experience, and you can use Scripture. And experience could be everything. It could be simply,
Does that sound like sola scriptura to you?
hey, we have a problem with the quality of water in our town. We need to contact some consultant who knows how to fix the water in our town. And
That's quite a bit. I mean, using the example of bad water in town, if you look at Flint, Michigan there, it's not a really good example to bring up in favor of politics.
you contact the consultant, and it's funded through the county, and the consultant says, you need to do this. And the county says, oh, that makes sense, and it's not too expensive. We'll do that, and the water improves.
I think, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think probably that example, I'm just speaking for myself here, that example would have only worked if it began with once upon a time.
Or, hey, we got an issue with sewage, or we have a growing population. We need to get water to these people. Where are we going to get water? You don't need Scripture. Scripture's not going to tell you where to get water. You know, if you're in the middle of central North Carolina, you can't open Scripture to find out where you're going to find water.
But the politicians can.
You find the water, and then...
No, you don't find the water. The politician finds the water for you because you're too stupid to do it yourself. They're the ones. You don't know that you need water until a politician comes and tells you. That's their job. They identify the problem. They tell you that you need water, and they tell you where to get it.
You determine how to get that water from the water source to the people, and that does not involve even natural law thinking. That just is a technical issue. I mean, then it deals with some property rights, eminent domain, other issues that come up, but none of that is some grand scriptural application. It's just you, through your own reasoning, thinking process, identifying a problem and then enacting the solution to it. And that's how most government issues happen. That's how most government issues are handled, especially...
He's right about that. That's how most government issues happen. I like this first phraseology better than the second there.
The local and the state and even the federal level. Most of the things that our various legislative bodies do is incredibly boring. It's boring.
Incredibly wicked.
It's dealing with real issues, but it's dealing with technicalities that
that they've created. All corruption is tied back to man-made law somewhere. All institutional corruption comes back to a man-made law somewhere. We're nowhere close to being done with man-made law. We've got millions of laws to pass yet. Goodness knows millions have been tried. If you look at the history of the United States, how much they've tried versus how much actually got through, is quite a difference.
Bring about some good once they identify some bad, evil, or the absence of good, I guess. Anyway, that's what that is. Just like in life, we think, let's say we want to go from our house and we want to get down to the gym downtown somewhere. And we hear that this road is closed. And we realize the ordinary means to seek my end is to go down that road, but it's closed because they're fixing the road. Well, we deliberate and think, I guess I could go this way or that way, this way, and we decide upon the best route, usually what's the most efficient route to get to the location. Didn't require scripture. It just required basic experience and application of basic common sense, and we get that. A lot of government legislation is nothing but that. You don't need a chapter and verse to figure out how to figure out a second route to the gym.
But you do need a politician to tell you how to get it there. You do need that, because without the politicians, again, he said earlier in the podcast, we'd be driving on the wrong side of the road. I don't get where he's like, something is so simple as regulating how we get to the road. We need politicians. And now he's saying something as simple as how to get to a location using the road. You just use basic common sense. You don't even need legislation for that. But earlier he was making this big case. If we don't have laws telling us where to drive, we're going to get in accidents all over the place. It's not driving for me, Dr. Wolfe.
Same thing with legislation. Identify a problem and fix it. So, all right. I've been talking for, I guess it's been about an hour. So that's my take on theonomy. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of responses and some hate. Let me just say, I'm not condemning anyone. I consider them Christian brothers. I have disagreements. I think in a lot of matters, we're on the same side and we can work together. I've tried with maybe a couple failures. I've tried to be very friendly with theonomists when it pertains to theonomy. And I have to say that I think I've received more hate than I've actually dished out. But at the same time, I think theonomy, as a practical matter, has several different problems, from politics to its own internal consistency to its application in society, and it denies the basic demands of the world we live in today, and has a sort of radical libertarianism that would actually be very destructive and bad. And there's a reason why it's never happened. But if
well, I mean, I just don't know. I don't understand how you could make that claim. It's never happened. For the first Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and for part of 1 Samuel. So what's that? 8 and a quarter books of the Bible. It was happening. That's what they were doing. They were living life, having a gay old time. I mean, I wasn't all sunshine and butterflies, obviously. A lot of it wasn't. I mean, talking about the time of the judges, most of it was. They were doing all this without a county commissioner, without zoning laws, without a legislative body, without all of the statism that Dr. Wolfe wants. To have a Christian nation, you cannot divorce God's law from a Christian nation. Righteousness exalts a nation. What's the opposite of righteousness? It's sin. What is sin? Lawlessness, as John says. What is sin? He defines it for us. Lawlessness. And Dr. Wolfe is constantly trying to posit having a Christian nation without God's law. And it just kind of comes out, as I've heard someone call it, it's not Christian nationalism, it's natural law nationalism. And soon it's just going to be nationalism, I fear. If I could challenge everyone, please read Psalm 119. It's not too much to ask that you read Psalm 119 and have the same attitude as the person who wrote that psalm. Read Psalm 119. Adopt the same attitude as him. Okay, Christ dying and rising again doesn't mean that that attitude is somehow inapplicable and could be looked at in a standoffish way. read Psalm 119. Meditate that it's not talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not talking about Isaiah. It's talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Consider the claims of it. Read it and apply it to God's law. Even the most bizarre, weird thinking law, like why boiling a goat in his mother's milk, that's weird. Read Psalm 119 and say, okay, it's talking about this law. This weird law that I think is so bizarre. But here's the Spirit of God saying, hey, it's pretty great. Just read the Bible, specifically the law, in the context of Psalm 119. Sorry, not the law, Bible, but read the law, because that's the context of Psalm 119. It's talking about God's law, its statutes, its ordinances. And it's not too much for me to ask you, please have that same attitude. Dr. Wolfe obviously doesn't have that attitude. I don't know why. But we have a responsibility to take the psalmist's attitude on all things. If Christ is quoting the Psalms, obviously we're going to be quoting the Psalms. Just take that attitude, please. It's not too much to ask. And then come back and tell me all the problems with not having a legislature. Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Think and Reform podcast. I hope this has been beneficial. I hope it has been edifying to you. And we'll be talking about this again in the future. We're so neck deep in our statism. It's hard for us to view the law of God without enforcing it and without importing our statism and judging the law through a statist lens. It's very difficult to deprogram all that statism and just looking at the law the way that God tells us to do it. God told Israel to do it. And that, Paul tells us to do it in 1 Timothy chapter 1. The law is good if it's used lawfully. It's not laid down for the just, but for the unjust. And then he goes on to list, civil crimes. So it's hard for us, especially if we place a premium on philosophical musings and traditions that are above Scripture. And that was one of the benefits of sola scriptura. It put Scripture back in its proper place and put it, and everything else was in the other category, if you will. Hierarchy there, but it was still the other. Just read Psalm 119 and think about what that chapter has to say. And you have two choices. Either you can believe it and believe the claims that it makes about the law of God, or you can say, this isn't true anymore. Jesus died and rose again, and now this psalm is not true anymore. So, it's the longest book in the Bible. I think God's trying to tell us something. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Dr. Wolfe, for asking all these questions and broaching this subject. And I hope I wasn't disrespectful to anyone who is a natural law person, or especially the general equity theonomics guys. The current understanding of general equity theonomy, that is. But I hope it's been beneficial to the kingdom. And always remember, my friends, think and reform.